As part of the series, Developing Evidence for CAM Through Research, this talk describes an essential part of a research project, the review process. Certainly as a researcher, conceiving an idea, developing a hypothesis, designing experiments to test the hypothesis, analyzing collected data, and reporting the results are the exciting and fun part of research. However, project review is a mandatory part of the research. Not only is it required by NUHS policy, but if it's your intent to publish your results, most peer-reviewed journals will not accept articles that have not been reviewed by an ethics board. But the process is not meant to be an obstacle. In fact, having someone outside the study can clarify your proposal, can streamline your procedures, and ultimately make the project work better. So let's take a look at the review process in detail from the outside in, when we're not anxious to get through the review, get the signatures, and get started. Before going over the NUHS process, let's take a minute for a bit of background on the review process. If you talk to people doing research in the 1970s, even into the early 1980s, they'll tell you that their institutions were not very involved in the research project. Matters dealing with ethical conduct were self-regulated. There were abuses, but by and large, most researchers followed the do-no-harm philosophy. What changed that was a story about a research project conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service. Now, in the early 20th century, public health's goal was to control the spread of venereal disease. Diagnostic tests had been developed in the first decades, and PHS required men entering the armed service to be tested for syphilis. Couples getting married had to take Wassermann tests, etc. PHS had identified geographical areas across the United States with extraordinary high incidence of syphilis, over 25% of the population, leading them to question if the disease perhaps behaved differently in African Americans than in other races. So in 1932, they began a prospective observational study to monitor the progression of syphilis. 600 men were recruited for the study, two-thirds of which were infected with syphilis. Most of the participants in the study had never received any medical care, so seeing doctors and nurses was viewed as a good thing for the participants. However, the men were never told the nature of the study, nor that they even had syphilis. Even when penicillin became available as a safe, highly effective cure, the study continued. When World War II broke out and hundreds of participants went to register for the draft, PHS arranged for the men to be exempted from the draft in order to continue the study. Now, the amazing thing is this was not a handful of researchers. This is a generation of researchers that were involved in this study. There were investigators involved that felt the study was morally wrong, and ultimately a former PHS employee provided information to the press. And when the story was published in the newspaper in 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study ended. The result was a class action suit that awarded millions to the survivors and their families. An apology to the survivors and their families by President Clinton on behalf of the U.S. government, and Congress enacting the National Research Act. Now, in a nutshell, the Research Act states that if research is federally funded, it will be reviewed for human protection by an institutional review board. In addition, the Act created a commission for the protection of human subjects in biomedical and behavioral research. The commission was made up of lawyers, bioethicists, and laymen, and they were asked to identify the principles for the ethical conduct of research and create guidelines for researchers to follow. The idea was not to dictate how individuals and institutions should do research, but to have a template that could be adapted. So the commission considered what constitutes research as opposed to medical practice. They developed an assessment of risk versus benefit and consideration of appropriateness of the risk to humans. In addition, they considered the equitable selection of human subjects so that risk was not being assumed by one group while benefits being gained by another group. Also, the specifics of informed consent. Now, informed consent was a major outcome of the Nuremberg trials after World War II. However, it was apparent that the participants in the Tuskegee study were not consented. So after nearly 5 years of meeting, the Commission published its report, and we commonly refer to this as the Belmont Report. So this brings us to the NUHS review process. Now this chart is a snapshot of the entire process. The process comes from NUHS policy and the procedures developed by the groups created by the policy. This is developed based on the recommendations given in the Belmont Report and the Code of Federal Regulations. The first step is directed by a policy titled Research Proposals that state, regardless of subject matter, human, animal, microbial, all research must be reviewed for scientific merit and approved by the Dean of Research. The Research Committee is established by that policy to advise the Dean, and this we term peer review. They look at new projects to ensure the work is scientifically feasible and consistent with university goals and policies. The committee is appointed by the president and includes members from various disciplines at national as well as both campuses. Now, if your project does not involve human or animal subjects, once your application is reviewed by the research committee and they recommend it for approval by the Dean of Research, that's the end of the review process and you're clear to begin. However, if your project does include human or animal subjects, then your project requires further review for subject protection. Animal studies have specific regulations and NUS policies. However, I'm not going to go into those in this talk. I'm only going to focus on studies that involve human subjects. Review of human projects involving humans is directed by the policy on protection of human subjects from research risks. As stated earlier, the policy was based on the Belmont Report guidelines and the Code of Federal Regulations. National tailored the policy to be consistent with our mission goals and other university policies. Contained in the protection of human subjects from research risk policy is the formation and operation of the Institutional Review Board. The IRB is appointed by the President. However, the makeup is very different from the Research Committee. Federal regulations require a non-scientist and a non-institutional member sit on the committee. Our IRB includes a Lutheran minister and a Doctor of Education to meet that requirement. NUHS policy also calls for a student representative, which seems appropriate for a couple of reasons. First, students are actively involved in projects as investigators and research assistants. And second, students often serve as research participants. So when reviewing projects, all projects, IRB considers that the risk is minimized, that it's assessed in relationship to benefit, there's an equitable selection of subjects, vulnerable populations. Most often vulnerable populations are thought of as children or prisoners or others that may be subject to coercion. Here, a vulnerable population commonly included in studies are students. The IRB closely looks through a consent document and the process for delivering and documenting consent. And in larger studies, especially clinical trials, an individual not associated with the study will monitor that the procedures and data collection are being done according to the approved protocol. IRB will want that monitoring plan and review the details with your application. Protecting the privacy of your studies and the data that you collect from that subject. You're permitted access to that information, so you must have a plan in place on how you're going to protect that information that IRB will consider. And if you are using a vulnerable population, what safeguards are you putting into place that they're not or don't perceive that they're being forced to participate? So while all projects go through these considerations, there isn't just one review procedure because some projects are very simple with little or no risk, while other projects are complex and carry risk. So one size does not fit all when it comes to review. For minimal activities that fall into specific categories of research specified in the Code of Federal Regulations, they may be reviewed by the exempt process. Now, don't get fooled by the word exempt into thinking it doesn't have to go through review. A project is approved as exempt after its review by the Dean of Research and the IRB Chair. And in addition, NUHS requires annual reporting to ensure that an exempt project has not undergone any changes. Projects that fall into exempt status benefit from the short forms. Both the new project application and annual review are very brief. Reviews are done by the IRB chairman, not at a convened meeting. Since IRB meets only once a month, that's a real time saver. Here are a couple of examples on types of research that may qualify as exempt. A word of caution here. There are a lot of other subjects that may also be exempt, and not all surveys or existing data qualify as an exempt review. Here are screenshots of the forms that are used for new project application and annual review. They can be found in the IRB section on the research pages of the NUHS website. Now, the next level of review is expedited. Again, these are projects with minimal risk that fall into defined categories, categories that are different than the exempt projects. The paperwork for expedited projects is more extensive. Now, for an exempt project, you basically provide the protocol and informed consent if needed. For an expedited project, you'll provide specifics on the procedure, when they're being done, how they're being done, who's doing them, how and when you're consenting people, who's delivering the consent, risk, benefit, etc., etc. But there is a benefit of having a project in the expedited category that it can be reviewed by the IRB chair and not at a convened meeting. And again, here are a couple of examples of projects that may qualify for expedited review. Here's a screenshot of the forms that are used for expedited projects. And again, you can find them on the website. Now, the final level of review is full review. Projects that are reviewed by IRB members at a convened meeting. The group that I described a few slides back, the non-NUHS, non-scientists, along with faculty, clinicians, and a student, look over the project and go down the criteria list in considering the project. The project forms are the same used for expedited projects. So there's the review process. Now, just a brief word about research that you may be conducting in conjunction with individuals at another institution. Both institutions are responsible for overseeing ethical review of projects, but that doesn't mean that duplicate reviews have to be conducted at both institutions. Depending on your involvement in the project, where recruiting and consenting and interventions are taking place, it's possible that a very simple review will be the most required. Again, the decision is made by the Dean of Research and the IRB Chair. So, everything has been reviewed, revised, and approved. What now? Keep all paperwork associated with your IRB application with your research files. That includes the application, the signed informed consents from your participants, and all IRB correspondence. Follow the approved protocol. In your application, you spelled out in detail how you are planning to recruit, who is doing consent and interventions, where and how data is being stored. Follow that plan. The quickest way to get a study shut down is deviating from approved protocols. Now, with that being said, changes in protocol come up. What sounds great on paper doesn't always work in practice, so it's common to need a change in protocol. Changes must be submitted and approved by IRB before you implement. There is a very simple amendment form that asks, what is the amendment, why do you have to do it, and is it going to result in a change to your informed consent document? Changes that don't really affect risk-benefit can be reviewed by expedited process, and in that case, it is an expeditious review. We are well aware that once you're recruiting, time's a wasting, so the turnaround on amendments is very quick. Finally, at national, projects are reviewed annually until you're done handling the data. Some institutions close projects as soon as all interventions and follow-ups are complete, but here IRB will continue to review until all papers are written. Projects that started with full review might be shifted to expedited review once all interventions and follow-ups are complete. That's to make it easier for you as well as for the IRB. The Research Coordinator will send out notice of annual review about 2 months before the review is due, so it's very easy. So, we've talked about case reports and studies a lot in the past year, so where do they fall in the research review process? Let's go back to the Commission on the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research and how they differentiated medical practice from research. Medical practice is used to diagnose and treat, but research is an activity to test a hypothesis, draw a conclusion, and, here's the big thing, contribute to the generalizable knowledge. So regarding case reports, much of the time you see a patient with an interesting diagnosis or a unique outcome and you want to publish that. Is that research? Maybe. So here's a little decision tree, and this is specific for retrospective cases, looking back at a patient's file. If you're not using identifiers in your report, you're doing no data manipulation. You're just basically reporting what's in the file. You might not need to go through any review. The same with prospective cases, continuing patients or patients. Nothing's experimental, no special population, no incentives, no added interventions. And be careful with this. Now, if in your regular practice, you always use an oral pain scale with your patients, if you change to a VAS or add an oswestry disability, that can be considered an added intervention. Once again, it might not need to go through review, but be on the safe side and ask. And regardless of retrospective or prospective, medical journals which publish case reports will require a consent from the patient for use of medical information. Unfortunately, each journal seems to have their own form, so you will just have to check journal instructions to authors. Now, the information that I've covered today is available in the Guide for Preparation and Processing of Human Research, better known as the Blue Book. It's about 35 pages that will take you step by step through this information. Again, it's in the IRB section of the research pages on the NUHS website. Same place where all the forms are located. The Dean of Research, Chairman of the IRB, and Research Coordinator are also great resources if you have questions or difficulty with your review process. So there you go. Your next project should be a cakewalk, and happy research.